Okay, well, welcome back. This is the second session of these videos on the mystical quest that I've decided to start recording. And there's not going to be much, not going to be really much in the way of any AI features in this video. I'm just going to talk. And of course, as I pointed out yesterday, the subtitles are AI generated, and I was playing with some tools again last night, and I really see that I don't have to do any of this. I could actually just ask a couple of these AI agents that would produce the whole video for me, and I would maybe look 40 years younger. I would have a different voice, and I could even have all the content generated for me based upon my old files, my old YouTube videos, my old university lectures, the books I've written, generate something really, really plausible, really quite plausible. But I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to sit here. One concession I've made today is because I want to show slides. I've decided to do this on Zoom instead of using my computer camera, and the resolution isn't as great. But at least we'll be able to see the slides. And before I show you a slide, I'm not going. It's not going to be one of those typical Zoom online workshops where I'm a little head and you see the slides all the time. I'm just not going to do that. I just want to talk to you the way I would if we were sitting in a seminar at the university, or if you were taking a course, we were sitting together somewhere in an ashram or a monastery talking about the spiritual life. But I do want to show you those 15 stages of the spiritual life. So let me just share my screen, and we'll just pop that up as, let's do it as background here. Okay, so yes, well, that doesn't really, I have to move. Okay, let me try a different share. Let's go back and share it. Okay, good. We'll stop that share and we'll share it again. We'll just I'll do it side by side. Okay. All right, so hopefully, yes, you're seeing that side by side. And these are the 15 stages of the spiritual path that I mentioned yesterday. Excuse me. As you can see, at first glance, it's 15 stages, so it looks like a very complicated map. It looks like on Google Maps, if you look at the whole itinerary beforehand. To make that simpler, yesterday I spoke about the three stages of the spiritual path in traditional Catholic mystical theology, Christian mystical theology, going back to the Greeks. And it's the stage of catharsis, or purgation, purification, or cleansing. And the second stage was the stage of illumination, illuminatio in Latin, in Greek, a beautiful word, elampsis. And of course, if you hear the English word lamp in that, well, that goes back to a Latin word, and lampus, and a Greek word from which the Latin word was taken, that takes as its root a lampain, which goes back to Indo-European, so it would be connected to Sanskrit. At any rate, that's the professor and me getting carried away with myself there with talking about things like that. But that's just part of the job. So the second stage is illumination, elampsis. And the third stage is union, unio, or henosis in Greek. Henosis gives this idea of unification, of oneing. The Greek word for one is hen. And Tahen is the name of the supreme one, the absolute one. So henosis, becoming one with what is ultimately real. So those are the three stages. And as you remember, I reduced that to two to make it even simpler. I reduced that to, and if this were a classroom, if we were sitting talking to each other, I would be looking at you, and as I am right now, wondering if somebody among you would like to contribute what those two stages are. Ah, yes, thank you. Yes, they are simply purification and illumination. The union can be seen as the perfection of illumination and the necessary process whereby we move from everyday mundane absorption in the so-called real world, absorption in the so-called real world that everyone thinks is like the most important aspect of reality that many people think. From that standpoint, moving from that standpoint to the standpoint of complete enlightenment it only occurs through a process of purification. Um, a sequence of intermittent periods of cleansing followed by sessions or seasons of illumination. And this is the rhythm of the spiritual life. If you will, these are the two seasons of the spiritual life. And so I said I wouldn't keep the slide up the whole time, like in a lot of these Zoom presentations that I've made. But what I want to do for at least a few minutes is I want to take a look at this slide. And I asked yesterday, that was the assignment overnight, to see if you can decide which of these stages are purificatory and illuminative. And if we were all sitting together and together, then we would have that discussion. Um, but since we're not, you please, if on the YouTube video, I think you can put up some comments. In my Substack, you can certainly make comments, and they would be really greatly appreciated. And if I do get comments or if people make notes at Substack, we can actually start creating a bit of a community. We can actually speak with each other, interact with each other. I think that would work really well on my Substack. And just for Substack, I think just put in Ken Rose 51, I believe. I'll have to look at it later. I'll try to post it later. Okay, so here we see 15, and maybe what I'll do is I'll run through them for the rest of this video. I think I'll run through them with you and just give a sense of how this path unfolds in light of those two phases of purification or cleansing, to use a contemporary English word, and illumination. Well, the first stage isn't really a stage. We could say these are the 14 stages of the spiritual path, because as you can see, the first stage I have highlighted in black type, because it's not really a step on the spiritual path. It's just basically life off the spiritual path. It's living, and I put that in scare quotes, living in the real world. And I live in Germany right now, and I've been here a lot over the years. I've actually lived here now for 6 years. And back in the early days when I was starting to learn German, I used to watch a lot of German television, and only to learn the language. I don't do that any longer. I haven't seen any German television in a long time, except for news occasionally, but that I get mostly online. And I remember watching these made-for-TV German television movies that would come on the weekend, and they were pretty generic. They had a pretty simple plots, and but what I really noticed about them was that whenever they wanted to show that somebody was really living a kind of a true, meaningful, authentic life, that they weren't just somebody that was passive and letting life happen to them, they always showed them as moving quickly from one place to the other, traveling, going to this country, having a relationship, having an emotional outburst, trying something new, paragliding, going off to somewhere in South America. It was always movement, action. And for a lot of people, that's living in the real world. The real world is this kind of external place of stimulations. And the more stimulations we have, and the more we're able to creatively interact with them and maybe profit from them, maybe monetize them, then that's the real world. That's the world that we're all educated to live in. That's the world we're supposed to take most seriously. And actually, the point of the spiritual life is that that's just not true. That's an illusion. It's not that the world is some kind of complete illusion. No, but because we do have these lives in which we can also unfold spiritually, unfold as human beings, in which we can experience some of the deeper realities through literature, through art, through relationships with others, through service. So this is not Maya in that sense of a complete pointless illusion. But it is Maya, it is illusion when we think that the real world is that world of hectic activity in which we're trying to profit and monetize and have experiences to the full to get through that so-called bucket list before we pass from the scene. So my point is, the point here is that that's not the real world. The real world, the true world, is within. And it's not just within, because as we awaken our spiritual intelligence, as we awaken our spiritual intuition, we'll discover that this external world, which we take as the real world, is actually a projection of a much higher and truer reality, a subtler reality. And hopefully over time, as we speak together, some hints of what that inner world, which is actually the true world, is like, will come through. So, unawareness, living in the real world, is actually not a step because we have to step away from that. What we need to do to make the first step on the spiritual path is we have to step away from that. One other point I would make is that I've been in this intensive 7 day AI seminar, and this is also another form of that frenetic activity where we're rushing intensely to try to use these new tools so that we can generate avatars of ourselves and so that we can have these tools create new videos, new books, whatever maybe a movie, a book, whatever, so that we don't have to do all that work any longer. And so we can free up maybe a whole week out of our month and we can go, I don't know, go on, do whatever it is we were dreaming of. But, we know how that works. Um, for most people, if they have like a regular job and if they can produce the same amount of work in 4 days that they did in five, well, that just means they're going to start having an extra day of work. So actually, it's speeding everything up, and it's another example of that hectic rush to monetize things, to try to generate some content so that we can get more likes. So I want to pull back away from that. I wouldn't mind a few likes. That's great. But I'm not monetizing this. It's just on YouTube. I guess who knows what would come from that. On Substack, my account is free. So the question is, how do we get onto the spiritual path? Well, in this series of videos, and I'm referring to the first step as awakening or seeing the path. And, we have to see the path before we can step onto it. Not only that, we have to know that there's a path before we can step onto it. And that's probably the most difficult stage or transition point in this whole itinerary. Because for many people, this doesn't occur unless perhaps two different kinds of events occur. And the first event is probably the most common, and that is some difficulty comes into our lives. And of course, every life has difficulties, and we will not escape from them. But perhaps a really momentous event occurs. I won't go into a lot of details because we don't need to trigger any memories for people listening to this. But it's just possible that something happens in your life that brings you to a kind of inner breaking point, a kind of hitting bottom, a recognition that things are just not going the way you thought they should go, and you feel at a real loss as to what to do next. And in some traditions, people maybe they were raised in such a way that they think of praying, and they might pray. Or if they don't have any tradition of prayer, that just it might just be an existential cry from the heart for help or for guidance. It could be even more mute and inarticulate than that. It could just be a sense that of I've come to a dead end in my life and I need a new pathway. I need an opening. So that's probably the most common way in which people enter into the spiritual path who haven't had any spiritual, conscious spiritual insights or inclinations beforehand. And that often, for many people, becomes a doorway onto this path because um, there's a deep truth about life that can never be effaced or erased by any kind of criticism, critique, whether it's literary criticism, critical theory, social theory, physicalism, and science. And that is that if we cry out from the depths of our being for help and guidance, something happens. There's always an answer. And that is the deepest spiritual truth in our human existence. And that we can access that divine help, that divine consciousness in an inarticulate way without even realizing what we're doing by opening ourselves up, often through difficulties, to a higher perspective on our life. And that's often in the Christian tradition that's known as conversion. The Greek word is metanoia, and of course, for people in that tradition, these are familiar words. But it also happens, the Bhagavad Gita, which is a great scripture from Hinduism, says that people often approach Krishna. One of the reasons why they approach Krishna is because of difficulties in their lives. And so this is, in my view, the greatest evidence of the reality and the truth of the spiritual life. And not only that, it's the greatest evidence and proof that there is a God, there's a higher reality, there's a spiritual underpinning to our lives that we can tap into through prayer and meditation, and just through a desire to experience something other than the material world in which we live. So that's probably the more common way of stepping onto the spiritual path from the stage of unawareness, hitting bottom, you might say. And another path is less common, but it's certainly more dramatic, and that is the experience of having a sudden awakening. You think in the New Testament of Paul, Saul, the apostle Saul, on the road to Damascus, having that encounter which completely transformed him. And the history of religions is filled with stories of obscure people who were out tending the field and they had an encounter with a divine presence, or they entered into a river. People thought they had drowned, and in fact, they were caught up into the divine presence. And they came back from these encounters, sometimes as great teachers, as prophets, as sages, as great yogis. And others, for many others, this sudden awakening just reveals to them that, in fact, there's another reality, that there's a different path to go. So that's the second way in which it happens for many people, that there's a sudden awakening. It's more dramatic. I think it's probably more rare. And there's probably a third way as well, and that is the way, a more natural and harmonious way. And that's the kind of person who was raised perhaps in a very stable home with a very secure and gentle religious tradition where they were taught spiritual truths growing up, but they also had a physical and mental and spiritually good environment. And so they just naturally, in the midst of everything else they do, in the midst of their activities as a parent or a spouse or an employee or a business owner, they're also just basically spiritual. They are able to see everything in their lives as being undergirded by God, by truth, by reality, by Ishvara, by whatever name you choose. So that's the third way. It's the least dramatic, and it might actually be the most common. especially in times when, in more well-ordered and regulated times than in which we live today, in which there were stable institutions, not harsh authoritarian institutions, but stable institutions in which children were able to imbibe the basic teachings of religion, along with a good, widely based education, both scientific and in the humanities. So that's the third way. This reminds me of a nice division between two kinds of souls that was made by William James, well over 100 years ago. William James, of course, doesn't need much of an introduction to academic audiences in the English-speaking world, but first started. His first academic acclaim came from his experiments in psychology and the books that he wrote in the 1880s, 1890s. But he's probably most remembered today for his classic books on mysticism, known as the varieties of religious experience. I think I got the title correct, the varieties of religious experience or spiritual experience. It's a book that I know really well, and if I flub the title, then that's just because I'm speaking to you on the camera here. But his Varieties is a classic text on mysticism, and it's still valuable today. In fact, I think it's more valuable than much of the later critical material that debunks his approach that's been written. And I say that as a person who's written books about mysticism, I've spoken about mysticism for many years. I may be wrong, but that's my judgment. I would definitely only start a study of mysticism with William James. Um, uh, so William James somewhere distinguishes between two kinds of souls. Now I know that there's more than two kinds of everything, but it's helpful as a teaching device to think of two kinds of something. So he spoke of two kinds of souls. He spoke of the sick soul and the healthy soul. And this is, of course, a dramatic difference. And people, well, what's the difference between the sick soul and the healthy soul? And then the deeper question comes, which one am I? So for James, he said the history of religion is filled with stories of sick souls, people who are tormented by their past or by addictions or by trauma or by their life circumstances, and somehow or other through these difficult circumstances they find their way to some kind of spiritual security. And these dramatic stories, of course, think of in the Christian tradition of St. Augustine and other traditions. There are many other figures that we can speak about who had these difficult lives that were set right, that were given a new direction by a dramatic spiritual awakening. So those are the sick souls, and they, of course, get most of the attention. But James then went on to speak about the healthy soul, and there, just as I mentioned before, that's the third way, the quiet, gentler, unpublicized way of just ordinary folks raised in secure environments who grow up and they integrate a serviceable, workable spirituality in the midst of everything else that they do. Well-rounded human beings, healthy souls. And James, if I recall this correctly, I'd have to go look it up. These lectures are more spontaneous instead of preparing for hours with I just want to speak spontaneously from the heart. James, of course, as I recall, saw himself as a healthy soul. And he admitted his fascination for the sick souls. And I think in some of our lives, in my own life, I would have to say, given my biography, I started out more as a sick, tortured soul. But, many, many decades of spiritual practice and also trying to be a good human being and work in my vocation and to try to be aware through processes of purifications of my failings and and my character flaws, and to try to rectify them and to try to live in a more humane, spiritual, and ethical way. I think those 50 years now have actually moved me more towards being a healthy soul. And I think that's probably one of the great benefits of the spiritual path that I'm going to be to continue to talk about with you over the next days, is that if we started out as sick souls, we can definitely become healthy souls. And if we're healthy souls, it can be helpful to see just what some of the tumult is that these other folks are going through, because it can help shake us perhaps a little bit out of maybe some complacency that we might have, or a little bit of narcissism, or a little bit of self satisfaction. So I think that's enough for today. I'm really enjoying doing this, and I think I'm going to try to work my way through that whole path with you over the next few weeks. And I might post every day or so, or it might take a few days for me to get back to you again. But in any case, I'm glad that you're there, and I wish you and I forgot to stop share, but I'm back. So I wish you a good day, and we'll see you again the next time. Be well.